Ever since you sent over that document on cognitive biases, I swear I've been seeing them everywhere.
Really?
Yeah, like someone opened up I don't know, a window into how my brain works.
Yeah.
Honestly, some of it's a little surprising, you know?
It can be a bit humbling, can it?
It can.
To realize we're all walking around with these built-in quirks, I guess you could call them.
Yeah.
That color how we see the world.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, let's unpack these biases, shall we? We'll use that list, the list of cognitive biases document you sent over
Perfect.
as our guide. And hopefully by the end of it, we'll all be, a little wiser, a little more self-aware.
Sounds like a plan.
Yeah.
Yeah, the document does a great job of not only defining these biases, but also hinting at, why they exist in the first place, often stemming from our brain's effort to be, well, efficient.
Oh.
Even if it means sacrificing a little accuracy along the way.
Wow. Fascinating, right?
Yeah.
It's like our brains are constantly making these trade-offs.
Right.
Like weighing, okay, how fast can we think this versus how accurate is it?
Exactly.
Wow. Okay, speaking of which, let's start with one of the most pervasive biases out there, anchoring bias. What's the lowdown on this one?
So anchoring bias is essentially our tendency to get stuck on the first piece of information we encounter. That first piece of information, that first data point, even if it's completely irrelevant
Oh, wow.
to the actual decision at hand.
Okay.
This anchor, as it's called, then influences our subsequent judgments and perceptions.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like when you walk into a store and you see this ridiculously expensive pair of shoes,
Right.
and then suddenly every other pair of shoes, even if they're still pricey, you're like, oh, but it's a deal.
Precisely. And it's not just prices, right? This can creep into how we judge people, how we assess risk, pretty much any situation where we're forming an opinion.
It's so sneaky.
It is.
So recognizing this bias, I imagine, is crucial for making any sound decisions, right?
Absolutely.
Because if we're not careful, that initial anchor can really throw us off course.
For sure.
Now, speaking of potentially misleading information, this next bias is all about how our memory plays tricks on us.
Okay.
The availability heuristic. What's the deal with that one?
So the availability heuristic is our brain's tendency to judge the likelihood of something happening based on how easily we can recall examples of it.
Mm-hmm.
So vivid memories, recent events, things that evoke strong emotions, they all hold more weight in our minds,
Oh, wow.
making us think they occur more frequently than they actually do.
Oh, that explains why, I don't know, people are so afraid of flying.
Yes.
Because plane crashes, as tragic as they are, they make for, very sensational news stories.
Right.
So those vivid images get stuck in our minds.
Exactly.
And we think, oh my gosh, it's so common.
Right. And this ties into what our source calls the frequency illusion, or as it's more colloquially known, the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon.
What is that?
When you learn a new word. And suddenly, you see it everywhere.
Yes. Oh my gosh, yes.
It's not that the word is appearing more often, it's just that your brain is primed to notice it now.
Oh, wow.
And the media plays into this as well, by the way. The more sensationalized a story, the more available it is in our minds.
Right.
Regardless of its actual prevalence.
Wow. So recognizing this bias, I would say, is crucial for critical thinking.
Absolutely.
Especially in today's world.
Especially in today's.
Where we're bombarded with information from every angle.
Yes.
And while we're on the topic of critical thinking, there's another bias I think we have to talk about. The Dunning-Kruger effect.
Ah, yeah.
This one's a big one.
The classic case of knowing just enough to be dangerous.
Yes.
The Dunning-Kruger effect describes the tendency for individuals with low competence in a particular area to drastically overestimate their abilities.
Yes.
So ironically, it's often those who know the least who are most confident in their knowledge.
It's like that old saying, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. You see it all the time, especially online.
Oh, all the time.
People making these bold claims. But when you really start to dig deeper, you realize, oh, they haven't really thought that through.
Yeah, and the document highlights why this happens. It's a lack of what we call metacognitive awareness. They lack the ability to accurately assess their own competence.
Interesting.
They simply don't know what they don't know.
Oh, okay, so how do we combat this? How do we gain that self-awareness, especially if our own brains are kind of working against us in this way?
Right. That's where humility comes in. Being open to the possibility that we might be wrong. actively seeking out diverse perspectives and
Mhm.
being willing to adjust our views when presented with new information are all crucial steps.
So it's less about being right and more about being willing to learn and grow.
Yes, very much so.
I like that. Now, let's shift gears for a moment and talk about a bias that might make you feel a little bit better about yourself,
Okay.
especially if you've ever struggled to assemble furniture.
Okay.
Ever heard of the IKEA effect?
Oh, I think we've all been there.
Yes.
The IKEA effect, or effort justification, as our document calls IF, is the tendency to place a higher value on something simply because we put effort into creating it,
Yes.
even if the end result isn't exactly, prize winning.
Okay, I have a story with this one.
Okay.
The other day, I spent an entire afternoon trying to put together this bookshelf.
Uh-oh.
It was a disaster. Drawers that wouldn't close, shelves put on backwards, the whole 9 yards.
Oh, no.
But you know what? I still felt oddly proud of this, wobbly monstrosity.
And that's the IKEA effect in action. We're hardwired to find meaning and justification in our efforts, even when those efforts yield, well, questionable results.
So how do we avoid falling prey to this bias?
Yeah.
Because, let's be honest, sometimes we really do pour our hearts into projects that are, well, objectively not that great.
Well, it's about being honest with ourselves, right? About the value of our creations. Sometimes walking away from a flawed project, that's the smarter move, even if it stings a little, to admit defeat. But it's not always about tangible things, is it? This bias can also influence our relationships and decision-making in general.
That's a great point. Ever put a ton of effort into a relationship that wasn't really working?
Mm.
Or held on to an investment way longer than you should have because you'd already sunk so much into it?
Precisely. The IKEA effect can really cloud our judgment, leading us to overvalue things, even people, simply because we've invested that time and energy. It's definitely something to watch out for. And on that note of relationships, this next bias we're going to unpack, this one delves into the fascinating realm of empathy, or rather, I should say, the lack thereof, the hot-cold empathy gap.
Ooh, this one sounds juicy. From the name alone, I'm guessing it has something to do with how we interpret each other's emotions.
You hit the nail on the head. The hot-cold empathy gap refers to our tendency to underestimate the influence of what we call visceral states. Things like hunger, pain, intense emotions on our own behavior and the behavior of others.
So when we're calm and collected, it's hard to imagine why someone would, act out in anger, for example.
Exactly. When we're in that cold cognitive state, we struggle to fully grasp the intensity of those hot emotional experiences in others. We might judge them as being, overly sensitive or irrational, not realizing that if we were in their shoes, we'd likely react the same way.
Right. It's like that saying, don't judge someone until you've walked a mile in their shoes.
Precisely. And conversely, when we're the ones experiencing those intense emotions, it can be difficult to understand why others aren't reacting with the same level of intensity. We just assume they get it, They understand what we're going through, even if we haven't really fully communicated it.
Oh, wow. This explains so much about communication breakdowns, doesn't it? We're all coming from these different emotional states, and it creates these gaps in understanding.
It certainly adds another layer of complexity to our interactions. But recognizing this bias, being mindful of the influence of those visceral states, can help bridge those gaps. It's about cultivating empathy, even when it's difficult.
So how can we, apply this knowledge in our everyday lives? Besides trying to be more understanding of our more easily angered friends and family, of course.
Well, for starters, it highlights the importance of clear communication. If you're feeling super overwhelmed by a project at work, for example, don't suffer in silence. Communicate your stress to your colleagues. They might not be experiencing the same pressure, but by being upfront about your own emotional state, you're giving them the context they need to empathize and offer support.
That's really interesting. It's like we're giving other people permission to understand our perspective
Exactly.
by being more transparent about our own, internal experience.
Absolutely. And on the flip side, if someone's reacting in a way that seems, a little bit out of proportion, try to pause and consider the potential influence of those visceral states. Maybe they're sleep deprived. Maybe they are dealing with a stressful situation that you're not aware of. Giving them the benefit of the doubt can go a long way in diffusing a lot of tense situations.
So in a way, understanding this bias, it encourages us to be both more self-aware and more compassionate towards others.
I'd say that's a pretty good summary. And it speaks to a larger point about these cognitive biases. They're not just, fascinating quirks of our brains.
Right.
They have real-world implications.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's easy to get caught up in the, wow, that's interesting aspect of these biases, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that they can significantly impact our decisions, our relationships,
Yeah.
our lives.
Indeed. And the document you provided highlights just how pervasive these biases can be, influencing everything from our personal finances to our political beliefs. For example, loss aversion. This is the tendency to feel the pain of a loss more strongly than the pleasure of an equivalent gain.
Okay.
And this bias can lead us to make, well, frankly, irrational decisions. In investing, for example, clinging to those losing stocks for fear of realizing that loss, even if it's not the most logical choice.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like our brains are almost hardwired to avoid those losses.
Yeah.
Even if it means potentially missing out on, bigger gains down the line.
Precisely. And this bias can extend beyond finances as well.
Yeah.
It can make us reluctant to end relationships or leave jobs, even when we know deep down it's the right thing to do, simply because we're afraid of that loss involved.
So how do we overcome this natural aversion to loss?
It takes conscious effort. We need to reframe our thinking, focus on the potential gains of making a change rather than dwelling on the losses we might incur. Easier said than done, of course, but by acknowledging this bias, we can start to challenge those automatic thought patterns.
And that's really the key takeaway here, isn't it? Awareness is the first step toward making more, conscious, deliberate choices.
Absolutely. And this brings us to another fascinating bias that highlights the importance of careful consideration. The framing effect. This bias reveals how the way information is presented, the frame, so to speak, can dramatically influence our choices, even if the underlying options are objectively the same.
You mean like how a restaurant might list a dish as grandma's homemade apple pie?
Yes.
Instead of just apple pie.
Exactly.
To make it sound more appealing.
Or think about marketing campaigns. A product advertised as 90% fat-free sounds a lot more enticing than one that's 10% fat, even though they contain the same amount of fat.
It's amazing how easily our brains can be swayed by these, subtle cues like that.
Indeed. And the implications extend far beyond those consumer choices, by the way. The framing effect can influence our perceptions of political candidates, our interpretations of scientific data, essentially any situation where information can be presented in multiple ways.
So how do we guard against this bias, especially in a world that's just overflowing with information?
Right.
Much of it very carefully curated to influence our opinions.
It all comes back to critical thinking.
Okay.
Question everything. Don't accept information at face value. Look for different perspectives. Consider alternative interpretations.
Right.
The more we can challenge our own assumptions and biases, the more resilient we become to manipulation.
It's like we need to become our own fact checkers, in a way.
In a way, yes. And that's a perfect example of how understanding these biases can actually be empowering.
Right.
It allows us to take control of our own narratives, to make those conscious decisions rather than being swayed by these unconscious biases.
So instead of being at the mercy of these mental shortcuts, we can kind of learn to recognize them and maybe navigate around them a little bit better.
Precisely. And it's a journey, not a destination. The more we delve into this world of cognitive biases, the more we discover about the intricacies of our own minds.
Yeah. This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. It's fascinating and also just a tad bit daunting, to realize how much our brains are just operating on autopilot.
It certainly adds a new dimension to that old adage, know thyself.
It does.
But speaking of fascinating, the document you shared ends on a rather thought-provoking note. It mentions that humans aren't the only ones susceptible to these cognitive biases. Really? Animals, from monkeys to pigeons, exhibit signs of biased thinking.
You're saying even our primate cousins and our feathered friends have these built-in quirks.
It seems so, which raises a rather intriguing question. If these biases are present across such diverse species, how deeply ingrained might they be in the very fabric of intelligence itself?
Wow.
Are they an unavoidable consequence of how brains in general process information? Something to ponder.
Now that's something to ponder. It makes you wonder, are we all just hardwired for bias?
Right.
No matter how objective we try to be.
It's a question for each of us to contemplate, I suppose. Perhaps the answer lies in continuing to explore these biases, to delve deeper into those mysteries of our own minds and the minds of other species.
Well, on that note, you've definitely given us a lot to think about today. From the anchoring bias to the availability heuristic to that oh-so-relatable IKEA effect, we've explored the weird and wonderful world of cognitive biases and how understanding them, hopefully, can help us all make more informed decisions.
Remember, it all starts with awareness.
Right.
By simply acknowledging that these biases exist, we can start to, we take the first step towards mitigating their influence and becoming more discerning thinkers.
Absolutely. So, to our listeners out there, stay curious, keep questioning, and maybe take some time to observe the world around you. You might be surprised by the cognitive biases you uncover, not just in yourselves, but in others as well. Until next time, happy deep diving.